Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is CJ the Populist New Yorker, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Republican Party. More specifically, we're going to be taking a look at whether or not the Republican Party can remain viable in the future in national politics. There have been many theories circulating online for the past 10 or 20 years now, not just online but everywhere, that Republicans eventually will hit a ceiling nationally and will end up losing national elections due to demographic change and the generational divide politically. Now, we're going to take a look at some exit polls, some demographics, and really break down this idea and whether or not the electoral winter is inevitable for Republicans or not. So, one of the biggest states, one of the most important states for Republicans to win nationally is the state of Texas. If we take a look at the last time a Republican president won, was of course in 2016 with Donald Trump. But if we change Texas from red to blue, you'll notice that the Democrats, in that case Hillary Clinton, would have gotten 270 electoral votes. She would have won the election. That's how important the state of Texas is for Republicans, and it's a state that they're losing a grip on. If we go to the 2020 election, the state of Texas was down to a margin of only 5 points, a little bit over 5 points. This was a state that had voted 9 points in favor of Trump the previous cycle, Mitt Romney by 15 points, and of course McCain by 13, and so on. Back it goes. But this is a state that's been losing, the Republicans have been losing a grip on it. It's mostly because of the suburbs, more specifically suburbs are getting more diverse, and they're also becoming more hostile to Republicans in general. Now, most Americans live in suburbs. If you polled people urban, rural, and suburban, the majority of Americans, or a plurality or something like that, live in suburban areas. This is one reason that puts the Republicans in a precarious position. The Republicans have been losing the suburbs slowly for decades now. It really goes back to the 1980s that Republicans have been losing suburbs all across the country. If we just go back to, we'll use the example of Pennsylvania back in 1988, we'll go. The Pennsylvania collar counties are solidly red in the 1988 election. These are very suburban counties. We go to 1992, they're all blue, and they stay blue. And a lot of suburbs avoided that trend up until recently in the 2016 and 2020 elections. Texas' suburbs, for instance, have been getting a lot bluer. Places like Collin and Denton County, counties that went to Trump by over 20 points, or in the high teens at least, in the last election, going to Trump by only single digits. I'm just using Texas as an example, but we could go to any state. We can go to the state of Georgia. Gwinnett and Cobb County, once Republican strongholds, are now safe Democratic. And places like Georgia, Texas, Arizona, these were once Republican strongholds. Texas still is a Republican state, but the other two are now purple, if not slightly favoring Democrats now. So the question really becomes, can Republicans win if these trends keep up? And the answer is no, they can't. If Republicans lose Texas, they lose Georgia, they lose Arizona, and they can't win the Rust Belt, then they don't really have a path. They're not really viable in the future. Of course, this is accepting the idea that politics is going to be linear, which it won't be. But it certainly does make a strong case that if Republicans want to win without the state of Texas, they need everything else to fall in line for them. They need to win Minnesota, which, as of the 2020 election, is a likely Democratic state. It's very, very unlikely that Republicans would win Minnesota and lose Texas at the same time. Republicans in places like Virginia, Colorado, they're essentially lost causes for the Republicans as they're concerned. Virginia's a state that went to, I'm messing up all these tabs here. Virginia's a state that went to Joe Biden by 10.1%. Colorado, 13%. These are 13 points, rather. These are once Republican strongholds. We can go back to 2004. Virginia was a 53-45 state for Bush. Colorado, I think, was 51-47. Republicans have been losing ground in these states, and Sure, they've been gaining in the Rust Belt, but the Rust Belt is an area of the country that is losing population. These Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, all lost electoral votes from the 2010 census to the 2020 census. These are states that are losing population. The states that are growing, Georgia, Arizona, Texas, these states are getting a lot bluer. Republicans really only can reverse this trend if they do better with Latino voters, as we saw in Texas and Miami, for instance. Hispanic counties went overwhelmingly shifted toward Republicans. Not all Hispanics, but rural Hispanic voters in particular in Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, the border region. I don't know if the trend was replicated in the suburbs. It might have been, but I know white voters certainly shifted a lot to the left from 2016 to 2020. We see a similar trend in Florida as it pertains to southern Florida, which has a large Hispanic and Cuban population. Huge shift to the right. This is the only silver lining for Republicans from the 2020 election. If they can hold these gains with Hispanics, specifically focus on more cultural issues, probably move a bit more to the center on economic issues, Republicans might have a winning coalition. But as to whether or not Republicans will have an electoral winter in the future, I don't know the definitive answer. Obviously, I can't see into the future. But what I can say is the fact that it doesn't look good for them now. Republicans made really good gains in the Rust Belt, which helped them win the 2016 election. But they lost the Sun Belt in 2020. They were losing ground in the Sun Belt in 2016, and then it came to a head this November when they lost states like Georgia that they'd won by 5 points and Arizona that they'd won by 3, and they lost the Rust Belt. And I think it really had a lot to do with the election in particular, but this is a wider issue that Republicans are having where they're just not resonating with the majority of the country. There's a reason Republicans lose the popular vote every election since the 2004 election. Democratic states are growing. They're getting more blue. And you can't really say the same about Republican states getting more red. There are some. Florida's been getting more red. Places like Missouri, Indiana surely could get more Republican. Ohio, Iowa. But the bigger states, Texas, Utah, sorta, kinda, not really, but you're not really seeing North Carolina is kind of hanging on by a thread for Republicans. But again, we could see a situation where we lose Texas for the Republicans, North Carolina goes blue, Georgia blue, Arizona blue. You're at 302 already, and that's if Republicans were to win the Rust Belt. We'll even give them New Hampshire. Doesn't matter. This is not a winning path. Republicans, if they want to remain a viable party nationally, they have to win back Texas. They have to win. Well, they never lost Texas, but in this hypothetical, they have to win back Arizona. They have to win back Georgia. They have to hold North Carolina, and they have to make gains in the Rust Belt. Now, we're kind of in the middle, I guess, of a realignment period in a sense, kinda, in which we're still seeing rural voters trend massively toward Republicans, but that trend is mostly complete by now. Most rural areas, if not all except in really New England, and perhaps some majority Latino areas in the Southwest, most rural areas are strongly Republican. But the trends in the urban areas don't show any sign of stopping. Areas like Charlotte in North Carolina, Raleigh, Georgia, Atlanta continues to trend a lot bluer. In Texas, the Austin area and the Dallas-Fort Worth keeps trending bluer. These are bad signs for Republicans. So is an electoral winter inevitable? I don't think so. If Republicans can gain with Hispanic voters and hold on to white voters by the margins they do, I don't really think it's realistic that Republicans are going to make significant gains among black voters unless there's a change in policy or outreach or something like that. But ultimately, Republicans do have that problem. Their leading demographic, white voters, are becoming less and less of a portion of the population, and older voters are old, and they tend to lean more Republican, and the generation coming after them is a lot more liberal than they were, and it really puts the Republicans in a bad position going forward. It wasn't that long ago in 2004 where a lot more states were competitive. Again, states like Virginia, states like Nevada going red, states like California only going to John Kerry by 9 points, 10 points, just about. States like Oregon and Washington being single digits. This is why Republicans won the popular vote. Republicans nowadays winning the popular vote is near impossible with the current dynamic we have, with California really being a 2-to-1 state for Democrats. Margins like that, you can't really overcome that as a Republican trying to win the popular vote. And the popular vote does matter, not in terms of elections, but in terms of the fact that over time, this is going to be emblematic of America as a whole. The majority of Americans already voted for Democrats. That's been since the 2004 election. Hillary Clinton got a plurality, but she still won the popular vote by 2 million votes. And this trend doesn't show any signs of slowing down. But again, the white pill, I guess, for Republicans is the fact that they're gaining among Cuban voters, Hispanic voters, newer constituencies that they really haven't been able to tap into in a very, very long time. That's the silver lining for them. If they can make the Rust Belt a lot more red and they can stay competitive in Texas, Georgia probably not so much, but maybe Arizona, Nevada. If they could roughly keep the electoral map where it is, they'll be in a good position for at least another decade or so. But after that, it's really hard to predict where American politics will be. Again, we were once at a point where New Jersey and California were Republican states, and Democratic states included, well, the state of Georgia's recently flipped, but places like Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina. So it's very likely that in 40, 50 years, the electoral map will look very different than it does today. In fact, the electoral map looks very different than it does since 2008. Really, in 2008, we had places like Indiana go blue. We had places like Iowa and Ohio go blue, North Carolina, Florida. The map looks very different nowadays, and it's going to continue to shift that way, and perhaps we'll see some electoral surprises. But my verdict is I don't think there's going to be a national Republican electoral winter, as policies are always changing, constituencies are always changing, demographics in terms of how they vote is fluctuating, even though it has been fixed for some time among minority populations. It's starting to shift slowly but surely, and I think that will, to a sense, keep Republicans relevant nationally speaking. But I really think it all depends on the policies that are relevant in the future and whether or not Democrats really drop the ball with these populations. And it seems in some cases they kind of are. But as to whether we will see competitive presidential elections in the future, I certainly think so, for the reasons I just listed out. But I'd like to know your thoughts about this topic in the comments below. Please like this video if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any new videos. As always, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.